Howdy, folks. Just a quick video this time. I'm working on something else, but I learned something very disturbing, and I've just got to weigh in. It turns out Jimmy Dore had some of my tweets on his YouTube show.
This will not stand, This aggression will not stand, man.
Fight fire with fire, I always say. Time for my own show. Ordinarily, I wouldn't bother with this, but I think it's worth exploring as an example of the comically dishonest rhetorical tricks of anti-vaccine propagandists like Jimbo here, and to stoke some good old YouTube drama. Oh, and unlike Jimmy, I've linked every source I mentioned in the description so you can check my sources if you want. Let's listen for a second.
So just so you know, I have to set up the story. This is from the New York Times. For children without a serious medical condition, the danger of severe COVID is so low as to be difficult to quantify. The risk of long COVID among children, a source of fear of many parents, is also very low. So low you can't even quantify it.
So first off, he's quoted a number of sources here saying that individual children who contract COVID have a lower chance of dying than if they get the flu. Got that? Keep it in mind.
This guy, Ryan Cooper, tweeted out this article from sciencebasedmedicine.org. So it sounds super duper fastball down the middle, right? I mean, come on. And the article is labeled COVID-19 is deadlier than the flu for children. What? And I got scared because I'm like, wait a minute, I've been reporting the opposite. And so I clicked on it. And then it says, as COVID-19 is much more contagious, in total, its total harms for children exceed that of the flu, a very simple point that often excludes those who compare these diseases.
Now he mumble quotes my tweet, or sort of at least.
Exclude.
At the risk of belaboring the obvious, the point of the quoted sentence from the article by Jonathan Howard is that when it comes to health outcomes, there is more to a disease than what happens when an individual person catches it. It also matters how contagious the disease is, and in fact it matters more than how lethal it is. This might sound odd, but it's clear if you think about it. Total deaths from a disease must equal the fatality risk of the disease times the number of people who contract it. It follows that a disease which is very deadly but not very contagious will kill many, many fewer people than a disease which is only somewhat deadly but very contagious. Consider a simple thought experiment here. If patient 0 of a virus infects 2 more people on average, then if you do the math, after 4 cycles of infection you'll have 16 new cases. If they infect 6 people, which is about what the Delta variant is estimated to do, then after the same number of cycles you'll have 1,296 new cases. Exponential growth is why contagiousness can completely swamp deadliness when it comes to total illness and death. For a concrete example, rabies is maybe the most deadly virus known. Without treatment, it seems to have a virtually 100% fatality rate with only a handful of demonstrated survivors ever. Yet even before a vaccine was developed in 1885 and distributed en masse in the following decades, it only killed around 100 or so Americans per year. Because it is pretty hard to catch it. You've got to be bitten by a rabid animal, and even then there's only a relatively small chance of actually contracting the virus. The contrast with the COVID death toll speaks for itself. So here's Senor Dore's response to my tweet. Brace yourself.
What I found, one of the quotes from the article is, it may be true that children younger than 5 years have a slightly lower risk of dying if they catch COVID-19 than if they catch the flu. That's from the article, LOL.
So neither me nor the author of this article ever denied that COVID is individually less dangerous than the flu for kids. The entire argument of the piece, and indeed the very sentence he is responding to, is that you can't ignore the transmission factor because it is a key determinant of the total quantity of infection and death. The whole paragraph in context, which Jimmy does not show on his program, makes this crystal clear. Quote, "There are 2 ways to compare the diseases. Which is more dangerous for those who contract it, and which is more harmful overall, the latter being the more important of the 2 metrics. It may be true that children younger than 5 years have a slightly lower risk of dying if they catch COVID-19 than if they catch the flu. However, as COVID-19 is much more contagious, its total harms for children exceed that of the flu, a very simple point that often eludes those who compare these diseases." So Jimmy here saw this sentence which A, not only pointed out that the idiot gotcha talking point that COVID is less dangerous than the flu for kids is wildly wrong because it leaves out the more important half of the equation, namely how many kids get infected, but also B, mocked anti-vaccine numbskulls for not being able to grasp this very important point, and he just blurts out the exact same gotcha again in response. And then he made a YouTube video boasting about how good an own it was.
Now that's funny. That's just fucking straight up funny. That's just plain funny.
Yeah, Jim, that is pretty fucking funny. And by the way, all this has been a major topic of conversation among epidemiologists and pop science media for the entire pandemic as they've discussed the dynamics of disease transmission and the risk of variants. If you cracked a newspaper once in the last 18 months, there's a good chance you've seen something on this. It is honestly staggering to me that he's making a video out of this. Sean did a really good takedown on Dore and got him dead to rights lying about whether he said ivermectin works against COVID.
Dore commented on ivermectin's effectiveness against COVID-19. No, I didn't.
However,
widespread distribution of ivermectin proves effective in Mexico against COVID-19. This has been suppressed. And now we're finding out that ivermectin treats this COVID. That if you just use ivermectin, and by the way, this data has been out there for a while.
uh-oh.
So what about, can we talk about ivermectin?
Yeah, sure.
So I covered it, what they did in Mexico City, and ivermectin seems to be a drug that not only treats it, but it will prevent you from getting it.
Well now.
But here he proudly reads aloud an argument in which he looks like a complete imbecile to anyone who can parse an English sentence and perform elementary school arithmetic. I think maybe he really is that dumb.
God damn, there's a lot of stupid bastards walking around.
Moving on. Jimmy quotes another tweet where I futilely tried to explain all this to him, and then quotes another of his anti-vaccine followers arguing that it's not fair to compare the 2020-21 flu season to the COVID pandemic since most were at home or masked.
Then he comes up with this. He says the entire argument is that even though the individual risk of death is less, it is so much more contagious that more children will get it and end up dying. That means 900 kids dead from COVID thus far as compared to 1 from the flu in 2021. Now, why can't you do that? Because 2021, you have to keep it out of the equation. It's dishonest. You are even posting because people were in fucking lockdown last year.
You see the problem with this idiot gotcha talking point? It's not too hard.
Ready? Drum roll.
Once again, Jimmy has confused evidence for my argument with evidence against it. It's true that lockdowns and masks work against the flu, but that's the entire point I've been trying to make this whole time. You can't fairly compare a normal flu season without any pandemic controls to COVID with them, because that's comparing apples to oranges. If we had had no controls for the last 18 months, then many, many more kids would have gotten COVID and died. Conversely, it turns out that influenza is so much less contagious than COVID that masks and social distancing reduce transmission almost to nothing. That's the key reason why it is so much less deadly in the first place. Either you compare the real numbers now, or you'd have to run an experiment somehow where you let both the flu and COVID loose without masks or anything to see what happens.
Don't you see?
So this is actually proof of the very idea we've been talking about this whole time. And it's pointed out in the exact article under discussion, which Jimmy, once again, noticing a pattern here, does not mention. Quote, comparisons between the flu and COVID-19 are confounded by the fact that much of normal life was suspended the past year and masks were ubiquitous. These measures lowered the transmission of both diseases. Therefore, the most meaningful comparison between the two diseases is the past year. The numbers couldn't be clearer. According to the CDC, 490 children under age 17 years have died of COVID-19 in the U.S. Skipping a bit. In contrast, the CDC reported that just 1 child died of the flu during the 2020-21 flu season. End quote. By the way, this article was written back in July before the monster Delta surge, so the number of deaths is about 400 short. More on this in just a second. So Jimmy is comprehensively wrong on the facts here. But wait, there is more. The fact that he is even raising a fuss about this in the first place is, if anything, even more misleading, because this whole argument is totally irrelevant to the question of child vaccination. It doesn't matter whether or not the flu is worse for kids than COVID. It's completely beside the point. If you pull your head out of the knee-jerk contrarian septic tank and think for 5 seconds, the relevant question is obviously whether getting vaccinated is more dangerous for kids and everyone else than them getting COVID. That is the actual choice we're talking about here. There's no like Johnny Virus Seed going door to door to families and saying, hey, you want your kids infected with the flu or the coronavirus? Jimmy skates over the question that actually matters in just a couple seconds.
And it doesn't affect kids, so why are you vaccinating them? If it affects an old person, tell them to get vaccinated. That's what we do. And if you're afraid of COVID or catching it from a kid, get vaccinated.
Here's why, Jim, for 2 reasons. First, according to the CDC, about 900 American children have officially died of COVID. And there were probably many more that were missed. For all those deaths, there were many more serious illnesses with unknown long-term complications. All evidence we have indicates that the vaccine basically prevents all death and serious illness among children who are exposed to the coronavirus and has only a microscopic risk of side effects. Not a single child has been proved to die from vaccine complications despite tens of millions of doses administered. What's more, the only serious side effect of heart swelling, seen in perhaps 0.001% of vaccinations of younger folks, according to one study, is also much more commonly seen in a case of COVID, and in a more serious form. Here's a child heart doctor quoted in the New York Times. The reporter says COVID-19 itself, he noted, is much more apt to damage the heart permanently. Statistically, that's way more likely. Therefore, it is nearly certain that most of those 900 children would be alive today if they had been vaccinated, and very possibly every single one. Of course, many of them weren't eligible to get dosed yet when they died, but a substantial portion were. I don't know how many kids getting killed for no reason is too many for Jimbo here, but for me, it's 1. 900 bereft families is 900 too many in my book. Call me a sicko lib all you want, but I think it's bad, actually, to let kids die if we can prevent it. And that goes for the flu, too. The fact that hundreds of kids die during the average flu season is also a tragedy, and one that could also be ameliorated with vaccines. The CDC says that about 80% of pediatric flu deaths are not fully vaccinated. Funny how Jimmy doesn't mention that either, almost like kids who died from influenza are just fodder for cheap gotchas in his career project to make tons of money clumsily pandering to anti-vaccine conservatives. Anyway, coming back to the original point about transmission, it's even more important that kids be vaccinated so they don't infect others. If it's bad for kids to die for no reason, then I'm just going to say it. I don't care if these mainstream, wealthy, corporate media guys attack me for it because I'm a bold truth teller who won't be silenced. By God, it's also bad for adults to die for no reason. Yeah, I said it. The older you get, the greater your risk of serious complications or death from COVID. And as Jimmy and the rest of the anti-vaccine crowd is constantly telling us, the vaccines don't work 100% of the time. By the way, this is a great example of the classic dumb guy thing of forgetting to make sure your tendentious talking points don't contradict each other. When he's arguing that kids don't need to be vaccinated since there will only be a few hundred tiny corpses, Jimmy justifies that by saying adults can protect themselves with the vaccines if they want to. But then he can't resist pointing out that the vaccines aren't 100% effective all the time. And in the process, he implies that vaccines don't prevent transmission at all, which is not true, but never mind.
I love what this guy says. He says, funny, I thought vaccinated people can spread it too, because they can.
That implies that kids should be vaccinated to protect their family members whose vaccines didn't fully take for whatever reason. James, Jimmy, Jimbo, you got to pick one, buddy. At any rate, we've already seen the danger of leaving out kids in England. Unlike Portugal and Spain, they dragged their feet on vaccinating teens as soon as they could, and as this Financial Times analysis shows, that meant many more teen cases and therefore many more breakthrough infections among vaccinated adults who got exposed. Fundamentally, for the pandemic to end as quickly as possible, we need to reach herd immunity levels, and the math tells us that is something like 85% for the Delta variant. The latest research shows that with a booster, all the vaccines are about 95% effective at preventing infection. And there is a credible argument that boosted immunity should last a lot longer than the first shots. 90% vaccination ought to get us there, and every vaccinated person, whether they're an adult or child, gets us one step closer. So that's the science squared away. Vaccines equals good. Endless pandemic, dying, or spending a month in the ICU equals bad. So let me zoom out a bit. It's taken me, 15 minutes of talking and hours of writing in preparation to carefully debunk 4 minutes of this goofball chump either lying or being world historically stupid, or both, about vaccines that are our best weapon against the worst pandemic in a century. Aside from countering some dumbass arguments and standing up for myself, of course, it's a fascinating example of how a factual discourse can become completely corrupted. I think the most telling part of this whole stupid mess was this interaction with an apparent member of Jimmy's loyal fan base. It's actually mentioned quickly in the video, though as usual, Dore doesn't quote the entire thing. It's remarkable. Mr. @BeCoolForever here behaves just like Jimmy does. He blurts out one idiot gotcha talking point, and when I come up with a counter argument, he tries to change the subject to a different idiot gotcha that is also wrong. But I keep pressing the guy on the original point, and he keeps hopping to new gotchas. It's like a Monty Python parody of an intellectual discussion. This guy very obviously has no fucking clue what he's talking about. He's just got a handful of annoying, half-understood troll arguments and Reddit screenshots that he randomly slaps down in triumph like Yu-Gi-Oh cards. It's the kind of cheap debating trick that reminds me very much of arguing with creationists back in the day. The point isn't to discover the truth, or even try to do that, really. It's to distract and confuse your opponent and try to convince onlookers that you've won. So, whatever. Some goofball is wrong online, news at 11. But if there's anything useful to be gained here, it's how to recognize a bullshitter. I'm not an epidemiologist, though I do have a science degree as it happens. But I've been in the debate pedant trenches online for many years, and I know a bullshitter when I see one. When a comedian posts a slapdash video about a complicated topic composed of Twitter argument recaps and duplicitous article summaries, none of which he links to or quotes in full, you ought to be suspicious. When his arguments continually avoid the core of a topic in favor of side issues which may sound bad but upon reflection are largely irrelevant, you should be more suspicious. When he insists that he's not an anti-vaxxer but his comment sections are stuffed full of committed anti-vaccine lunatics, the picture comes into focus. When he constantly flits from argument to argument without exploring any of them in depth, particularly on scientific topics, where there is always a ton of complexity and nuance, it gets even clearer. When he makes paranoiac claims that anyone who disagrees with him is a lying corporate sellout, all while making his money from a huge corporation and openly pandering to the most popular name in corporate cable news, you can be sure.
He's full of shit.
Well, that's it, folks. This went on a bit longer than I thought it would. But I think it was worth going through Jimmy's dishonest bargain basement rhetoric one time at least. My next video is going to be an argument for Medicare for All. Something Jimmy used to at least pretend to care about before he became another bellowing conservative halfwit. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe. Stay tuned, and always remember, practice argumentative hygiene, and beware of bullshitters.